You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hello, Jenni. Welcome to the Yoga Medicine Podcast, or welcome back, I should say, because you are a returning guest. Thank you for taking time to talk to us today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Rachel.
I'm happy to be here too. I feel like we are potentially more excited about this topic than listeners will be, because I know strength training is something that comes directly from your very varied movement background, including being a CrossFit level 1 coach. And I pretty much grew up in the gym because my mum was a gym bunny. And so I was dragged along with my coloring books and pens to watch her lifting heavy things in the gym. But maybe, as I suspect, listeners aren't quite as excited about the importance of strength work as we are. So I thought we might start by kind of running through the benefits of strength training, just to make sure that we kind of get people on board early.
Definitely. And I'll just start by saying that I love that your mom was one of the original gym bunnies. That's so cool. I'm sure she's feeling the benefits in her life now.
Absolutely.
But yeah. And, just based on what you're saying, I will try to make it my job during this podcast to get people excited about strength training and hopefully make it feel more accessible, and like there's like a really there's actually a lot more overlap between strength training and yoga than people might consider. So hopefully just seeing that there is a little bit of an entry point that might make it feel a bit more accessible. So obviously the main sort of thing that people think about when it comes to strength training is that, you look leaner, you look better, you have more strength. Now, those are all like really obvious benefits of weightlifting and strength training. But the overarching benefits extend so far beyond just like aesthetics or being able to pick up heavy things. And they really are so all encompassing that it comes down to, quality of life, not just lifespan, but health span as well, which is a concept that I know you've talked about. And this idea that popped into my head earlier when I was thinking about this was one of my friends who is a very experienced strength coach. She was talking about using strength training as a means of making herself harder to kill. That was like her exact phrase. And I think that sounds really extreme, and it's kind of funny as well. But at the same time, that's literally what it is. It does so much for you on so many different levels in terms of the physiological processes in your body, that it really that really is the outcome, is that you are like more resilient and more like
you can fight off
able
the Grim Reaper
to survive. Yes, yeah, totally. In hand-to-hand combat. There's all kinds of benefits beyond just the obvious like strength and aesthetic ones. So as we get older, we know that strength training is really, really great for maintaining bone density, because bones, unlike our muscles, which respond to tension, bones actually respond to compression, which is what we're giving them when we externally load our skeletons, especially the axial loading. Anything that is going to enhance your body awareness, your proprioception, which strength training definitely does, is going to be really helpful too, because that's another of our capabilities that starts to kind of wane as we get older. And really what we're looking to do is like reduce the risk of falls, because those end up being so potentially catastrophic and lead to a real decline in quality of life. And there's been a lot of interesting research recently too about how sarcopenia, so the loss of muscle tissue in later life, is now appears to be very strongly correlated with cognitive impairment, cognitive decline as well. All of that leads to loss of independence and becoming dependent on caregivers. There's all kinds of statistics about diabetes, insulin resistance, so many different things, and ligaments and tendons also really prefer heavier loading. So we really need that external load to stimulate those tissues and keep them healthy and strong as well, which is going to help us to physically stay more stable and more resilient and strong as we age as well. And just coincidentally, this morning I was actually listening to a really interesting podcast where the guest was Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who is the huge proponent of not just strength training, but protein in general, like through the across the lifespan. And she had this really interesting angle on things where the sort of public obsession that as a society we have with weight loss has actually been very detrimental to this conversation about strength, because we've become so fixated on losing fat that we've actually lost sight of the real problem, which is not that we're overweight, but that we're under muscled, because muscle tissue plays such an important role in so many different functions in our body that, you know, it shouldn't be optional for us to use our muscle tissue. And there's an argument to be made that our human bodies were made to not just move, but move in ways that like are physically very challenging. Like you want to be getting out of breath. You want to be doing things that make you sore, like not just every once in a while, but on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I think it's so great that the research and there's a more public awareness is starting to kind of gather around this notion that like this is something that we really should be paying attention to, especially where not just in terms of our health, but our quality of life as we, through from like childhood all the way to the autumn of our years.
Oh, that's very delicately put. I love that. You've laid out like a smorgasbord there, haven't you? It really doesn't matter what people are interested in. If your driver is how you look, great, do some strength training. If your driver is how capable you feel of handling the challenges of life, great, do some strength training. If you're looking for metabolic health and good reaction to insulin, do strength training. If you're looking for good cognitive function through the course of your life, great, do strength training. If you want to have better mood and reduced risk of falls and reduced risk of injury, great, do strength training. So whatever gets you out of bed in the morning, whatever drives you, do some strength training. And I guess we're having this conversation now because life has become pretty comfortable and pretty easy. And even, a generation ago or 2 generations ago, there was still plenty of heavy lifting to do with, hand pushed lawn mowers and hand worked washing machines. We just had to do a lot more work that would make us sweat or grunt that we can quite easily avoid these days.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's great that we have Apple Watches and Fitbits and stuff that help us to track our activity levels, because it's obviously really good to be aware of how much you're doing and like, being able to being cognizant of that. But I think one of the problems with doing that is that it kind of almost creates this impression that what should be like a baseline level of daily movement and activity is now this thing where we're tracking calories. We're just like walking around, like sweeping the floor, vacuuming, like that doesn't constitute exercise. That's just you being a human, like at the most basic level. So I think it's, it's kind of one of those double-edged sword things where it's helpful to some extent, but then it kind of can also make us look at it through a slightly distorted lens.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a place where you've been in a really sedentary phase and focusing on that incidental activity can make a big difference of just getting up that little bit more often and doing a little bit more housework or, walking around the block. That can be such a really helpful starting point. But I do think we've gotten to the point where we feel like that's the end point, and it's really not. It's really just to to give us the wherewithal to keep going and to keep challenging ourselves to do harder and harder things.
Totally. And of course, it can be really nice it can be a very strong motivational factor as well to see that you are like doing more and more, your, activity levels are increasing. But you're totally right in saying that our modern life it's so odd. If you think about the fact of like paying a lot of money for a gym membership or like, a CrossFit membership, which tends to be on the more expensive side, but then you're like driving to get to a place for someone to tell you how to move around when, not that long ago, those would be things that we'd be doing the equivalent, just like working in the field or doing construction or something like that.
And I mean, I'm not complaining. I am definitely not suited to working in the field. I don't like to get my hands dirty. I hate gardening. Anyone who knows me knows how much I hate gardening. I'm not complaining that life is comfortable, but everything has trade-offs. And one of the trade-offs for a comfortable life is that we need to find ways to make life a bit more difficult. So let's assume that we've convinced people. And if that hasn't convinced you, people, head to Yoga Medicine online. Tiffany did a monthly dose a couple of months back about all the benefits of strength training. There's a bunch of research links listed there for those of you who don't trust us and only trust the research. Go read the research. But say it worked. Say we convince people and they're all now very excited about incorporating strength training. It's bamboozling. There's so much information out there, and so much of it is staunchly conflicting. You must do this. You must never do this. This is dangerous. This is important. That it can kind of become analysis paralysis. Like I don't even know where to start. So maybe we move on to busting some myths and misconceptions to hopefully demystify the whole experience a little bit. And I know you have some favorites, so I might let you kick off with your favorite myths and misconceptions about strength training.
Sure. So I think especially in the yoga community, one of the ones that we hear a lot, and thank God this myth is getting kind of debunked on a pretty regular basis now, but this notion that strength and flexibility are diametrically opposed and really can't like coexist on any level. And I think when you start to think about how our bodies function and how our muscles function, then you start to see just how erroneous and oversimplified that notion is, because our muscles aren't really doing anything of their own accord. They're actually just slaves to the nervous system. So the nervous system commands, like, there's going to be some mechanical restrictions, but to a large extent, the nervous system does govern how we move. So, that being said, the nervous system really only permits ranges of motion that it feels that it has control over. So, essentially, what that means is that back in the prehistoric days, our survival would very much depend on us being healthy and fit and able to move around, gather food, run away from predators, all that kind of stuff. And being able to do that really required us to be like uninjured. So that means that your nervous system really doesn't want you to go into any extreme ranges of motion or any extreme joint positions that you can't actively control or come out of. Mm-hmm. So essentially, your nervous system really only permits the ranges of motion that it perceives as not being a threat to your tissue integrity. And range is really where we're the most vulnerable to injury. So that's where we are most likely to like tear a ligament or a tendon, or even like get a little muscle sprain or something like that. So essentially building strength in a wider range of motion, learning to control those end ranges of motion is really what gives us access to them and lets us take ownership of them. So I think that's kind of the foundational notion behind this, that strength is actually the prerequisite to flexibility in many ways. And I would also argue that when we work with people who are like injured or low function, the much more common pattern that we see in them is that they are tight and weak. Mm-hmm. And tightness and weakness are two things that I think rarely occur in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's less about building strength, although of course that's the important thing, but we also want to be building strength in a wide range of motion, which is how we can actually take control and ownership of that range.
Yeah, I
So
think that's a really important point to make. And I think that's something that those of us who work with people one-on-one have seen time and time again. You see something tight, and I guess the back of the mind instinct is, oh, how can I stretch that? How can I release it? But so often I've seen, and I'm sure I'm not alone, you make that tissue more capable, more powerful, and the range of motion just comes. The body feels confident.
absolutely, because your nervous system picks up on the fact that, oh, I do have control over this range. I can control this joint position. This feels safe. I'm going to permit this. So it
Mm-hmm.
really, that kind of like comes before. And stretching is going to be useful in a limited capacity if we're talking about building like true comprehensive function. That's going to be something that we can functionally use. I also think that something that can get in people's way as far as this debate of like strength versus flexibility is that if you do strength train, then every once in a while you're going to be sore and you might even have, DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. And those are things that are going to temporarily make you feel stiff, but they are not the same thing as
Mm-hmm.
you having lost range of motion. So that would be another thing that I would caution people against. That's just a very natural sort of protective mechanism that your body is doing. It's a temporary effect, and it's gonna go away. And for anybody that's worried about losing range of motion, I would maybe give you the example of incredible strength athletes like Olympic weightlifters who, they compete in movements like the snatch and the clean and jerk, both of which have very, very significant range of motion demands. So their ability to even perform those movements safely hinges on like their strength, their power, but also their ability to get into those joint positions. And these are athletes who actually become competitively disadvantaged if they lack those ranges of motion,
Mm.
because as the weight gets heavier, as they're lifting more and more, it's not just about having the strength to lift the weight. It's also about being able to drop low enough to catch it.
Mm.
So without access to that range of motion, then you're just going to be having to make up the difference with raw strength, which is obviously going to be much harder. And if you think about what the bottom of a squat or like an overhead squat looks like in Olympic weightlifting, we're talking massive amounts of thoracic extension and shoulder flexion, full dorsiflexion, full knee flexion, full hip flexion, and external rotation. So we really
It's a shape
need
that a
that.
lot of adults can't get into at all, let alone with a couple of 100 kilos or pounds above their head.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, you just have to look at one of these athletes if you're concerned that like, oh, getting really strong, like this person who can, lift like hundreds of pounds over their head in one movement, like they are not suffering from a loss of flexibility at all.
Yeah, I think this one
Arguably,
comes from like a little germ of truth of personal observation. We've all seen the person in yoga. I have been the person in yoga who can, flop into the splits or take my legs apart and lay my belly on the floor and not be particularly strong if you took me to the gym. And we've all seen the person at the gym. It definitely used to be a guy. I don't know that that's still true, but the really muscle bound dude at the gym who's got, ripples where I don't even know that there are individual muscles and, can't do a
his
door frame
triceps have
stretch.
triceps.
His triceps have triceps, exactly. So we've all seen the extremes, but that doesn't mean that those things have to be opposites. That doesn't mean that those things cannot coexist. And in fact, neither of those are perfectly functional examples of humans. The hugely muscle bound person isn't necessarily the strongest person, and the floppy yoga student isn't necessarily the most flexible. They've just got places where their body is really comfortable for them to hang out without muscle engagement. So I think there's that little germ of truth that we've kind of built into a story that is hopefully now starting to get retold.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually love that you brought up the image of the muscle bound guy at the gym
And definitely not
because
just guys anymore too. There are some chicks with triceps on their triceps.
yeah, absolutely. And and this is not a knock on bodybuilding at all, because it's clearly a sport that like many
Mm,
people enjoy and get a lot out of. But just like you pointed out, those people are often not functionally the strongest, because the way that they train is by isolating specific muscles in like a very, very particular way. And as we know, as you're moving through your life and the world, those movements are not representative, nor do they translate to how
mm,
we move in the real world, which is a lot more like instinctive and like full body style, where all the different parts of your body and the different systems are coordinating together in this very like instinctive way to execute around the needs of the task. And I actually kind of think that the bodybuilding stereotype is partly what created this notion that strength training is going to make you like stiff and bulky.
yeah.
There's a
Because I
few
mean,
reasons
they
why.
work so hard. They work so hard and single-mindedly to get big and to get all of that muscle individuation. The idea that that could happen by accident, by picking up a weight once or twice, you just have to watch a bodybuilder to see how much effort, energy, thought, focus, care, time that practice takes.
I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. When people say that they're worried that they're going to accidentally like get bulky, that does not happen. It takes years and years of very deliberate, intentional training, like a huge amount of dedication and commitment and nutritional tweaking to get to look like that. So it's just
Mm.
not something that's going to happen like randomly, or like, whoops, I woke up and I'm too ripped today. Like that's not what's going to happen.
Said
And
nobody ever.
no, exactly. And the other thing about bodybuilding is that it's like its own weird, unique
Mm.
thing, because the way that people get to look like that is because they train in this very specific way. So bodybuilding is really geared towards the ultimate goal. There is hypertrophy, which is to
Mm.
make your muscles bigger. And the way that we get the most hypertrophy is by working primarily in the mid range, because that's where we can generate the most power.
Mhm.
So there's a couple of things, that's kind of like the training method that's going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of what you're trying to achieve. But when you do that, when you work exclusively in that mid range, granted you're getting the hypertrophy, but there's a few other things happening as well. The first one is that by definition, by sticking to the mid range, you're not using your full range of motion. And eventually, your whole system will adapt around that. It'll determine, your brain will determine, like, oh, well, we don't need those other ranges. We're
Mm.
just going to let go of those. So eventually you do lose access to the ranges of motion that you're not using. So that therefore you are stiffer and less flexible.
Mm.
The other thing is that because we're going for this, the goal is this like increased cross-sectional width of your muscle. Eventually your muscles do get so big that they themselves are in the way of free movement. Like your
Mhm.
muscles themselves become so bulky that they start to inhibit your range of motion. Now, as I mentioned, these are things that are very, very specific to bodybuilding. So if you look at CrossFit athletes or other like functional fitness athletes, you'd be hard pressed to find any of them looking like muscularly excessively bulky, because these are athletes that are performing a really large variety of different movements, different loading scenarios, different combinations of movement
Mm.
patterns, and they're
Plus
using their
explosive,
their
high
full ranges
speed,
of motion.
endurance. Yeah. And I guess the other thing
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
strikes me when I watch CrossFit, as I do religiously watch CrossFit, it is a very exciting spectator sport for people who haven't figured that out, is you'll see somebody who is gigantic, huge legs, huge shoulders, big arms. You'll see somebody right next to them who's half my size, and they're performing really similar tasks. So you do really see that strength and size are not the same thing. That functional
Hmm.
strength, the strength to lift something or throw something or catch something or pull your body weight, is not the same as a big muscle. And that really fascinates me, because I guess in the back of my mind, I maybe did have a little germ of thought that muscles need to be big in order to be strong, but obviously not true.
Yeah, I think that you really do observe this exact thing that you're describing when you look at people who are truly like very versatile and skilled in their movement and their use of their body in general, is that they look like well-rounded, well-balanced athletes. Like you can
Mm-hmm.
see it because of all the different things they're able to do, and you can see it in their bodies, which are also, they look well proportioned and like
Mm.
very versatile and well balanced in their bodies too.
Mm. So hopefully we've laid to rest the myth that you're going to wake up accidentally ripped one day, or that you'll pick up a weight, do a bicep curl, and then accidentally be gigantic. That really doesn't happen. It can, if you get into bodybuilding, it can happen, but just ask any bodybuilder. It takes a long time, takes very specific training, and then you've got to diet like a crazy thing to get those muscles to show. So
Yeah.
definitely not something that happens by accident, and unlikely to happen to the average yoga student who just wants to add in some additional strength training.
Yeah, and I think I personally have not gotten into bodybuilding, but I think that the people that do it seriously will also tell you that the cutting is really like not a fun aspect of it at all.
Mm.
So you really do have to be very committed and dedicated to go through all of that. Like it's a very extreme thing that you're putting your body through on multiple levels.
Mm. So, what are some other myths that come up for you when it comes to strength training? We had strength and flexibility can coexist, and in fact, do very happily coexist. The more of our range of motion we are strong and controlled in, the more range of motion our nervous system allows. We talked about the myth of accidental hugeness not being a thing.
Yeah, so I think that there is a little bit of a debate that's pretty interesting in the yoga community as well about whether like body weight training is sufficient for
Oh,
getting all of
yes.
these different health benefits. Um, and there's some fear mongering potentially as well about whether strength training or weightlifting is dangerous. But I would say that based on the very large and robust body of research that we have now about the benefits of strength training and all these different boxes of like functionality and health that it checks, that arguably the benefits of or the risks of not strength training are much more
Mm.
significant than of having like a well-rounded, very very moderate strength training routine. But ultimately I think it's going to come down to the individual needs of any one person.
Mm.
What's your situation? What are your movement goals? What are the things that you want your body to be able to do, and subsequently what kind of loads do you need your body to tolerate? So that's why I think this conversation about what strength training is and what it does is so useful, because it really, like, I want to kind of turn it back around to like, okay, well, what is it that you want your body to do? And then
Mm.
is there room for a discussion about how strength training might be a complementary or useful thing for you to integrate to really support those goals? So if you're a person that wants to move around in a bunch of different ways and have fun exploring different movement patterns in your body, then it's very possible that like maintaining a regular body weight yoga or other movement practice is going to be sufficient. And that's not to like make that sound like it's like less than anything else, because for those of you that have done like a bunch of burpees or push-ups or like pull-ups, that's
Yeah.
hard. Like that stuff
Yeah.
is hard. It's not easy. So there's a lot that you can do in terms of body weight training. And if that's in line with your goals and your particular needs as an individual, then that could be perfectly sufficient. But if you have more specific goals or more particular things that you're dealing with, then you might consider adding some sort of strength training. So if you're
Mm.
trying to perform like more challenging feats of endurance or strength, like if you have those requirements and those demands, then it's going to be very useful for you to train the tissue resilience and the capacity to complete those tasks. That's
Mm.
for sure. Similarly, if you have something like osteoporosis, then you might seriously want to consider adding some external load to maintain your bone density. If you are somebody who is hypermobile, or maybe even has an Ehlers-Danlos syndrome diagnosis, then conservative strength training under the guidance of somebody who is specialized in that population is going to be invaluable, because this is an example, like an extreme example of an individual who is potentially going to be extremely, very, very flexible, but not have a lot of control in their body. Definitely not going to have a lot of strength. They're potentially going to be in a lot of pain. So what this person needs is stiffening. They need stiffening exercises in a very controlled and
like
more
the
limited range of
anti-yoga.
motion. Yeah, exactly. So, and those are all instances in which I think, strength training could be of huge benefit. And I think most people that get into strength training would probably also tell you that it's like a huge mood booster. It can be so amazing for like your confidence and your feeling really powerful in your body, especially for women, maybe even older women who really did not grow up in an era where it was considered quote unquote normal for women to go to the gym or strength train. It can be like discovering this whole new part of yourself. Like, I'm doing something that I never thought was possible, that I was capable of doing. So it can be so revelatory and empowering in that way as well.
I kind of think about body weight loading in a similar vein to that incidental exercise that you'd get around the house, cleaning, vacuuming, gardening for people who venture outside, that sort of stuff, in the sense that if you're trying to build strength from a baseline that doesn't include holding your own body weight, then that's a really, really powerful place to start. And I mean, even things that we do in yoga, like plank and standing poses, warrior poses, and downward facing dog. Those of you who don't remember being a beginner, that stuff is really hard when you're a beginner and you're building that strength. But when that stuff becomes easy and you want to keep getting stronger, then you're going to have to up the ante. And maybe you up it with movement, like the burpees and the pull-ups that you were talking about. Or maybe you have to add external load. So the challenge is that our bodies adapt. And so if we want to keep getting stronger and we want to keep building bone mineral density, we've got to keep increasing the level of challenge. So as our capacity increases and things become easier, we might have to increase the level of challenge and add some external load.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually makes me think of another sort of misconception, which is, as with most things, it's not like entirely black and white, but this notion that holding yoga poses for longer is building strength. So
don't break my heart, because it feels difficult for me. Don't be gentle with me here.
So that is definitely true to a certain extent, because what we're talking about when we're talking about building strength is really the sort of thing, the crux of it is time under tension. So that is the stimulus that is going to yield that adaptive response of your muscles and your tissues getting stronger. So if you're holding a yoga pose for a longer period of time, you are getting more time under tension. But just like you said, at a certain point, your body is going to become habituated to that level of loading, and you're going to have to add something more if you want to continue that upward trend of building strength. So you can add more duration to your hold, but at that point, what you're doing is actually building endurance rather than strength,
which is still a nice thing. But I guess it all comes down to what you're looking for, and I guess in my mind, what you struggle with. What do you find hard? Look for the things that are your kind of blind spots or weak spots and see if you can flesh those out. And maybe that is holding longer. Maybe that is being strong in a wider range of motion. Maybe that is adding external load. Find the things that challenge you.
Yeah. And these things, we don't have to think of them as being somehow like discrete or separate from each other, because endurance, strength, agility, power, these are all just different sort of facets or aspects of our movement capabilities and the overall capacity that we have. So the lines aren't always quite as delineated as we would like to think. And I think most runners that strength train would tell you that the strength training makes them better runners. Like, it adds to their endurance, and that's absolutely the case. I mean, if you think about somebody who's a runner who strength trains, they're putting themselves in a situation where they're becoming habituated to like moving really heavy things around. And running is a body weight activity. And subsequently, when you're used to moving really heavy things around, the body weight activity of running is going to feel comparatively easier. And because it feels easier, you can keep going for longer. So you've increased your endurance.
I think of that too, is when I've been hiking with a big heavy pack on and then I slide the pack off and it feels like, oh my God.
You feel like you're going to float off the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought up this notion too of, well, what is it that I need in like a functional capacity? Because sometimes that can be something really unexpected as well. Like, I, for example, recently strength trained a couple of ice hockey players who all ended up benefiting hugely from the increases in their lower body strength in terms of their levels of fatigue on the ice, their explosivity, because hockey is essentially a series of like short but very intense bursts of activity, like sprints. But I distinctly remember one of them also mentioning to me, like, oh, I remember like after a game when I normally would be completely wiped out, it was so much easier for me than it usually would be to pick up my huge gear bag and carry it to the car. Like, normally that would have been so tiring and it wasn't that big of a deal. So there's all these other like trickle out effects that end up having really beneficial effects on the rest of your life that aren't even necessarily connected to the thing that was your goal in the first place.
I love that. And it kind of brings up a bell curve of, I talked about how comfortable we've made life, how easy we've made life, and how we have to find ways to make it harder. But when we find those ways to make it harder, it actually makes life easier again. Which has to me a lovely kind of symmetry to it. Like our baseline level of ease is now at a much higher level of capacity or capability.
And another way that I think about that I think directly translates and correlates with this notion that you just introduced is that, people will often say that strength training gives them more energy. And one of the mechanisms that I think that happens through is that if you are strength training in a way that you're lifting heavy enough that you're going like to fatigue or even to failure, or maybe you're doing these kind of HIIT style workouts that have a little bit of external loading where you end up like very, very out of breath. So what you're doing there is enhancing your capacity to perform, to continue performing and functioning under fatigue. So like, just like you said, you're raising this threshold of like, where's the point where I get tired? And that line is just getting like higher and higher and further the whole time as you get better at functioning under, like, it takes a lot more to make you tired or even kill you.
I love that. So you perceive it as giving you energy, but really it's just you're practicing to do hard things so that the things that used to be hard now don't feel hard anymore. Yeah. Okay. You've sold me. And I think we've started leading into the interface between strength training and yoga practice, normal yoga practice. So given that we're looking for the things that people find difficult, if you had the average vinyasa student or teacher, myself, for example, sitting in front of you, what do you think would be the big missing links? What would be the areas of strength training that you think we should start with? Like, investigate. Are we talking about that overhead squat? Are we talking about more high intensity interval training? Are we talking about static holds? Are there any particular joint positions that you think we tend to have as blind spots? Where would you start?
So that's such a broad question because,
I know.
Again, it's gonna depend a lot on like the individual context of the person and
so say
their anatomy,
somebody who does
vinyasa
yoga, so they can do plank, they can do chaturanga, they can do warriors, but under body weight, no external load. Where would you start investigating for that kind of person?
Well, there's definitely, so I'll say this with the caveat that I think there's a lot of discussion also about all the different ways in which yoga is like deficient and an incomplete movement practice. So, and I actually I don't really agree with that, because that's like saying that like this apple is not enough like an orange. Like they're two different
Yeah.
things, and yoga is perfect for what it does. So that's not the point of this at all. But objectively speaking, there are some things that are missing from the yoga practice. Like, we don't really strengthen our hamstrings in a meaningful way. Unless we're moving really slowly and very intentionally, we could be getting more bang for our buck out of like really leaning into the eccentric phases of our movements, which are really a very effective strength building tool that we have access to even in a body weight capacity.
So like folding forward more slowly in Uttanasana or in a pyramid, going slowly and making the hamstrings work as they lengthen to hold our torso up against gravity effectively.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
great.
then once you're familiar with that sensation and what it feels like, then you are not that far off of like a Romanian deadlift, like a straight leg deadlift, which is going to be doing the same thing and strengthening your whole posterior chain. And I think the other kind of common in air quotes deficiency of the yoga practice that's mentioned is that we don't really have any pulling movements as well. So that's definitely something that would be beneficial to add in. I think in general, like especially for women who tend to be more drawn to yoga, upper body strength is a very common area of deficit as well in terms of strength. So working on that is going to be really useful. And this was some of the hockey players that I strength train are women as well, and for them that's a competitive disadvantage, because it does require like full body functionality, and it's not something that, unless you specifically are strength training, that you're really going to get from other movement modalities.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us don't notice that sort of thing unless, say, we're traveling. Remember, travel, everybody. And you go to put your suitcase in the overhead compartment. That might be the first heavy thing you've tried to lift in months. I know that's the case for some of my older students, where they're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea I couldn't lift this 7-kilo or 15-pound thing over my head.
Yeah. Sometimes it takes that moment too, where you're like, oh, that was a lot harder than I wanted it to be.
Totally. So upper body in general, I would totally agree with, because there's only so far that you can adapt to something like downward facing dog, where, okay, you're holding a percentage of your body weight overhead, but once you're used to that and it's no longer a huge challenge, then you've got to find some ways to spice that up. And I mean, you could be creative in your yoga practice. You can do some down dog push-ups and all that sort of stuff, but eventually you'll adapt to those too, and you'll need to add some load. And by pulling, you mean things like horizontal pulling, your hands in front of you, your elbows moving back behind you, overhead pulling, hands up above you, pulling down with your elbows by your sides. Yeah. These things are a little bit more difficult to get creative with in yoga practice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice. Well, there is, while we're kind of talking about the movement intelligence side of things, you have a course on yoga medicine and online training that really does dive into a lot of the foundational concepts that we've been talking about today, about just understanding this thing that is our body, and how strength isn't just stiff and tight, and flexibility isn't just loose and long, and how important it is to have control over varied joint positions and to be able to reverse out of movements, and also to train things like proprioception and coordination. So I would highly recommend for people who've been hearing concepts float around today and they're excited by them to go and check out that course, Movement Intelligence. We'll link to it in the show notes and see if anything comes up. Any other sort of myths or misconceptions or key areas of strength training that you'd like to reinforce for listeners?
Sure. So I think there is a little bit like there. It can feel like, if you have never strength trained before, like there's this huge like hurdle that you have to overcome, or it just feels like very overwhelming and scary. And I think you're right in pointing out that when we see all this stuff on social media, and there's a person with like 7 resistance bands looped around them and a PVC pipe, and they're like doing some stretch that looks absolutely insane
Super
and
fancy.
ridiculous. So that stuff can be fun, but it's really not, that's the icing on the cake. And it's not necessary. And often that stuff is also not the most effective or the most beneficial. And I'm a huge proponent of just like the basics, because they're the basics for a reason. People will come back to them over and over again for a reason, because they're really effective and they get the job done. So that's things like the squat, the lunge, the deadlift, horizontal and vertical pushing and pulling. Like it really is like pretty simple. And if you're at all sort of concerned about doing those things correctly, like I would first of all advise anybody who's getting into strength training to maybe get some coaching initially to make sure that you have like good form and all of that before you start to layer on external load and repetition and momentum and all these different things. So making sure you've got the basics down before you dive deeper and add challenge in various forms is going to be really, really useful. If you are working with any kind of injury or imbalance, I think it's useful to talk to a professional first as well, because you don't want to be inadvertently doing something that's going to reinforce or maintain your existing imbalance or injury as well. And it might be helpful for you to work in like a way that's potentially asymmetrical, where you're doing slightly different things on each side, just to account for that. I think it's also helpful to get coaching, even if it's just a little bit, because most of us naturally tend to lean towards the things that we're already kind of good at and find enjoyable. And that, you want to curb that tendency. If you're trying to develop a well-balanced routine that's going to like holistically serve you, then you want to kind of get a well-rounded repertoire to support that and avoid that tendency of just like, that other thing's kind of hard. I don't feel like it today. Like those are the things that you do that are going to be helpful for you to make sure you're incorporating on a regular basis. So having a little bit of external accountability can definitely be really helpful on that front too.
And I think you've given so much advice there that for people who've never set foot in a gym, or for people who've never picked up, a kettlebell or a barbell, just imagine that you're giving advice to somebody who's brand new to yoga, and they look at the yoga studio and think, gosh, that place looks really scary and intimidating. Well, some people feel that way about the gym, but it's just a place. And once you get in there and you get used to what's normal here and what's not normal here, it's not scary anymore. And for anyone who's starting out new in yoga, I would give the same advice. Find somebody who's an expert, get them to give you some advice as to what style of practice, which teacher, things to look out for, some keys of alignment. Sometimes when people start yoga, they get sore wrists. Here are some things that you can do to work around that as your body adapts. This is all the kind of advice that we would give to beginners in yoga. And the same stuff. What are the things that, is it meditation that you're like, is it chanting that you're a bit, that looks a bit scary? Give it a try. Expose yourself to those different patterns and see what happens. So I think if we kind of flip the advice to a yoga context, all of that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And I think approaching anything like this with a beginner's mindset can be so helpful as well. Like you're just there to learn. I personally love learning new movement things or like sports or anything like that, because I feel like it's just so incredibly interesting to like have that, like be learning from scratch, learning from something from scratch. You can discover so much about yourself and your own capabilities. And if you're, just like you said, if you're feeling at all nervous about it, then getting a little bit of like supervision and hand holding at the beginning can be really helpful. And it can be like reassuring as well.
Yeah.
You might have questions about like, how often you should do it. Is this how it should feel? All this kind of stuff. And
how quickly should I progress? And I mean, and maybe you're not like Jenni. I think that attitude is really admirable, but I am not the person who loves trying new things. I hate feeling like an idiot. I hate feeling incompetent. But again, working with somebody who's a professional can get over that too, because it can help you not feel incompetent and not feel like an idiot and not feel that you're wasting your time, your precious,
and actually, I also
time.
don't like feeling incompetent, but that's just my driver for like, okay, I'm going to get good
better.
At this. Just I want to get out of this initial phase of feeling like an idiot.
I love it. So say people are excited. Yes, we've sold them. They believe that strength training is important. They want the physical benefits. They want the physiological benefits. They want the mental and cognitive benefits. We've busted some of their myths. They're no longer worried that they're going to become stiff and tight. They're no longer worried that they're going to accidentally embiggen and become huge. They have understood that it's about having control over a range of skills, whether it is to hold strong, whether it is to be strong through movement, whether it is to be strong through maximum range of motion, whether it's quick and explosive or slow and smoldering. But they're still too scared to go to the gym. Where would you start on something like yoga medicine online? If you're somebody who's curious about strength training, but you want to dip your toe in very gingerly and with something that's somewhat familiar, do you have a couple of classes that you would recommend people try?
Yeah, definitely. So I have actually, let me grab my notes here. So
She has an
any of
extensive
my
list, people, so get
yes,
ready.
I did make a list. Um, so any of my slow and loaded classes, there's a series of them which incorporate external load, and they're essentially like a flow class that sneaks in some strength training movements. So it
Oh, I love
really,
some sneaky strength.
yeah, it's very sneaky. So you will be doing weighted squats and overhead presses and even things like Turkish get-ups or like little deadlifts and stuff like that. So really good way to like introduce those concepts in a context that you're maybe a little bit more familiar with as well. I also have a bunch of classes that focus on eccentrics, which we'll link in the show notes probably, I think.
Yes.
And those are a really good entry point as well, because they're just body weight. But like we mentioned, the eccentric phase of the movement is where we have the most potential for building strength. And it's one that in vinyasa classes, often, as we're like making our way through the movements in this flowing manner, we can miss some of the potency that's available by really slowing down and kind of leaning into that eccentric
It's usually
portion
the
of
phase
the
that
movement.
feels more difficult because the muscle is contracting as it lengthens. So if you're anything like me, you will be unconsciously speeding up through that phase to avoid
Yeah,
that feeling of difficulty. So this might force
totally.
you to just milk some of the extra strength benefits from that lengthening phase. I love that ish. I'm also mildly terrified.
That I think you're absolutely right. Like we all have that tendency of like you just want to skirt your way around the
Mm-hmm.
part that's a little bit like you instinctively want to try to avoid that difficult part. And um, I think just in general, if you're looking to get into strength training or incorporate more of these strengthening practices into your life, then one thing that really helped me and kind of demystifies the whole thing is understanding first of all how our bodies adapt to external load, the strengthening stimulus, and the timeline on which that happens. And I think this is actually something that I really like telling yoga students and yoga teachers, because really determining that for yourself is very much to do with your own awareness of your body, and something that we as yogis are already pretty competent at, like gauging productive intensity and like how you're feeling in your body. And the way that this happens in strength training is that if you imagine your level of fitness as a line over time that can like increase, go up or go down as your level of fitness increases or decreases. What actually happens after a workout or like really any activity where you've challenged or taxed yourself is that your level of fitness temporarily decreases. And that sounds really counterintuitive, but if you imagine, Rachel, that I got you to do like a really hard workout with a bunch of weights, and yeah, you're frowning, but
I'm
just
imagining it.
imagine hypothetically.
Oh,
And at the end, after you were like laying on the ground, out of breath,
moaning.
I asked you to do the same workout again. You
I wouldn't
might
be
be
able
able
to.
to do it, but you wouldn't be able to do it as well.
Yeah.
So your level of fitness would have temporarily decreased. But what happens then in the subsequent recovery period, in like the 24 to 72 hour window, is that your body and your brain are like, oh,
Crap.
Rachel made us do a bunch of stuff that we were not quite prepared for. And there's a chance that this might happen again. We need to reorganize some stuff around here to make sure that next time she tries to do something like this, we're more prepared for it. So in that recovery phase, the tissues repair themselves. Eventually, your fitness returns back to its initial baseline level as that repair work is happening. And then in anticipation of the next time that I make you do a workout, your body's actually like, let's give ourselves a little bit extra to work with when this happens next time. So that's the window where you actually have like a little bit more to work with that you want to next do your subsequent strength workout, because you actually have more capacity to work with. So that helps to figure out the timing. Like, when do I feel recovered? And I'm like excited. I feel physically and mentally stoked to go do this next little bout of training.
Yes.
That's the window in which you want to hit it. And you actually don't want to miss that window, because if you do, your body also very adaptively and intelligently realizes like,
it was that
workout, that was a one-time thing. We actually don't need to maintain this capacity. In fact, muscle is a very calorically expensive tissue to maintain. So if it's not needed, your body is just like, out of here,
get that
good
thing
riddance.
gone. Yeah,
and
I love
then
that.
you return back to your baseline level of fitness. So you've kind of like, you've lost the window. But once you start to get in tune with that, then it totally takes the mystery out of like how much and how often, because it really just comes back down to like, well, how do I feel? Like, how do I feel in my body? And then you can make the determination based on that.
I love that. I think that's a great way of looking at it. I think the one thing that, two things that came out there. The first one was judging your readiness to advance by your feeling of kind of interest and excitement and capability and capacity, and not missing that moment by thinking, I worked out last week, I'm good. And the second thing was the power of that recovery phase, that the workout itself is really just input or information. The real work gets done by the body afterwards, when you're recovering and figuring out, is that input going to become a regular thing? Do I need to become more capable at that input? So to me, that helps a little by making the exercise itself feel, not less important, because it's the trigger, but it's just an input. Don't make it anything that it isn't. Don't get freaked out about the input. I'm just feeding my body information as the kind of things that I want it to be better at and more capable of.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like the whole process as a whole is going to be more significant, like the way that you're looking at it in the big picture. And that's why, I sort of encourage people not to get overwrought about the specifics of what you're doing. And in fact, when people just want a really easy strength training plan, they don't want like a specific program. The way that I tend to phrase it for them is just, I batch together like lower body exercises, upper body exercises, core strength exercises, maybe break those up into like a few subcategories. So they're doing like a pushing and a pulling on different days. But then I just tell them like, pick one from each group and cycle through them till you feel tired, maybe like 4 times.
And I love that. And I think for the normal person, that cycle works a lot better too than the leg day, chest day that you see, real gym devotees do. For me, when I finish a workout, I don't want to feel like, oh my God, my legs are crushed.
Like
nothing
have no
happened
legs.
up here. Yeah. I like the feeling of everybody got a little bit of attention. Great.
Yeah.
Next. I think that's fantastic advice for people who aren't being super specific and just want to get generally stronger in their lives.
Yeah.
Love it.
And that's actually a really good point that you brought up as well about, not feeling like you just were decimated in your workout, because if it takes you days and days to recover, then chances are you're probably going to miss that window where, if you're incapacitated for days, then like, not only did you do too much, but you put yourself in a position where you're inhibited in your movement capacity for a long time after. So that's totally unproductive. And so the way to kind of gauge as a very general rule, like how much you're doing and at what weight, when you're working with lower weight at a weight that actually allows you to complete like 8 to 12 or 15-ish reps, then you're maintaining like general fitness, general capacity, and muscular endurance. When you add on a little bit more weight to the point where it feels manageable to do 5 to 8 reps, then you're building strength.
And that's time effective. I like that. If we're heading into something looking to build strength, you don't have to do 3 sets of 10 reps, that magical number that everybody seems to get. You can get it done much more quickly.
Yeah.
With good
and of
form.
course you want to warm up appropriately and like build up to that right level of loading and all of that stuff. But you can also change it up so that if you are doing a more heavy, more like focused workout for one particular part of the body, then, the next day you're going to be doing like a lighter weight, and maybe it's more of a full body workout, or you're focusing on a different region of the body. Again, for most of us who are just looking to generally be fit and healthy and strong, you don't need to get bent out of shape about the specifics. Just
start with the bread and butter.
Yeah. And there's a reason why those are the foundational movements that everybody comes back to. So
yeah, and I would say the same thing to somebody in a yoga context. Just start with the basics, figure out what you like, figure out what you don't like. But for God's sake, start somewhere. Don't let the analysis paralysis stop you from reaping the benefits. Yeah, I love that. I think that's all really practical advice. And you're right. It sounds challenging to find that what's just the right amount of load that I'm going to or close to failure, but not so much that I can't walk the next day. But those of us who've been practicing yoga for years have years of practice of tapping into signals from our body and gauging our workload appropriately and knowing what's going on while it's going on. So that fortunately is a skill set that we really already have.
Yeah, and that carries over to strength training more than I can even tell you. Like, especially if you start to get into the slightly more technical aspects of it, but even well before that, that ability to be really focused on the moment, the movement, the way that it feels in your body, the ability to gauge the productive level of intensity and speed and weight and all of this. Like, yogis are already so much more tuned into that stuff than the average person who like goes to the gym for I can only imagine for somebody who has no movement background at all. You're right, the gym is a terrifying place to enter for the first time, but yogis should actually feel pretty good, because having the coordination, the body awareness, and that internal gauge being so fine-tuned already, it gives you like a huge leg up on getting started on that path.
And I would also add too that gyms are usually really strong and supportive, friendly communities, just like yoga studios. So even though the people might look a little bit intimidating when you walk in, the same way that beginners often find yoga students look intimidating because, we've all got very quiet, introspective faces on that don't necessarily look friendly and receptive. If you're struggling, ask somebody for help. If you're not sure, how the machine works or what you do next, feel free to ask someone. People in gyms are friendlier than you'd think. As somebody who grew up there with my coloring books and my coloring pens, gym people are good people too.
And if you somehow stumble into a gym that is not friendly or doesn't have a culture of welcoming beginners, then
go somewhere new.
That's a red flag. Like, get out of there and find some place that is more prepared to like help you and actually serve you as a client.
100%. And I would give the same advice with a yoga studio. If you've stumbled onto the one yoga studio that's snooty and unfriendly, pick another one. I love that. I think that's given people some great advice. You've inspired me to get back into the garage and pick up some heavy stuff, especially since Steve bought me some weights specifically for me that I haven't touched yet. Where would you send people?
I'll check in on you. Oh, God. And see how you're doing with those.
My accountability partner. Thanks, Jenni. Where would you send people who want to know more about you and more about what you do?
Sure. So you can find me on social media. So I am on Instagram as Jenni Tarma, just my first and last names. I'm a little bit more active over on the social media profile of my company, Kari Prehab, and that's KAARI PREHAB.
It's like a spelling bee.
Yes, definitely. And our website has all kinds of updates about, seminars that we're hosting and like program launches and things like that as well. And that's just kariprehab.com, which you can also very easily find on our Instagram.
Great. Well, we will link to them in the show notes, as well as your class suggestions, as well as the Movement Intelligence course and Tiffany's monthly dose on the benefits of strength training. So there'll be plenty of resources to dive into if you do want to analyze a little bit more before you sneak out into the gym or, add some extra strength practices into your yoga practice. Jenni, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your enthusiasm. I promise I will pick up a weight.
Mission accomplished on my end then. Thanks so much for having me, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.